Vreau să-l invit să ne vorbească pe domnul Richard KALLSTRAND, care este director al autorității suedeze de poștă și telecomunicații. Și haideți să-i punem o întrebare care sună cam așa. Mr. KALLSTRAND, does PTS as an institution rely on a single package for all telecom services, or do you have multiple suppliers?
Thank you very much. We have multiple suppliers actually. At PTS we are not only the regulator, but we are also responsible to enforce and promote internet security in the society, and we like to walk the talk. So we have many providers. We have 2 fixed providers, we have a third one for mobile, and we also have backup solutions for that. So we try to use make sure that we are online all the time, even though one operator has problems. So, yes, I'm going to be talking today. First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Marinescu for inviting us, and I hope my presentation won't disappoint you. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Nordic paper. The paper that the Nordic NRAs, that is Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark and Iceland, put together on DSM, and this is the views we have on DSM and how the process, things that could be interesting to consider and work on in the process of the DSM. So to start, we think that fiber is very, very important. What we can see is that user need grow very rapidly. We can also see that the rollout speed varies. It varies between the different countries in the European Union, but it also varies within the countries. We can also see that the demand in growth means that the mobile networks are not enough. And we think that mobile networks and fiber networks should not be considered 2 different things, but it's actually, from a consumer perspective, more or less the same. When you are mobile, you're never more than a few hundred meters from fiber, usually. Either fiber to the base station, or when you're at home, or at your office, or in many other public places, you use Wi-Fi. And without Wi-Fi and fiber, the mobile networks would collapse very fast. As an interesting thing I can mention there, we were talking previously about Netflix, and in Sweden we do have Netflix. And this is not an official figure, but there has been some figures showing that in the mobile network of our incumbent, during Friday afternoons and weekends, more than 50% of all the traffic is based on Netflix. We believe that we're going to need access regulation in the future. More people will have access, but that won't necessarily mean more networks. So access regulation will be necessary, and symmetric regulation. We think that the European Union should look into and analyze the SMP regulation versus the competition control. If competition control is necessary, then perhaps SMP regulation is not necessarily the best way of going forward. I'm not saying it's the one way or the other, but we think that it's important to at least analyze and look into this. We think that voice regulation will become outdated. If we look at the Swedish market, voice is a dying market at the moment. It's decreasing, the revenues from voice is decreasing with 15 to 20% per year. Even though it's happening from a very high level, it's something that's happening, and if we look towards the future, voice is in itself is a dying market. It's going to become an app. So regulation of voice won't be necessary. When we look at the scope of the regulatory supervision, we think that it's very important to analyze the role of the OTTs, so the caps as we prefer to call them. Because it's important when we regulate that we do that with the future in mind, because we cannot regulate in order to preserve old business models. We need to regulate in a way that that gives the future as much possibilities as possible. sometimes there is a pressure on us as regulator to help the current operators to preserve their business model, but that is not our role. Our role is to help the consumer and to help society. We also need to see if we need special legislation for telecom, or if and caps, or if the general legislation is good enough. I'm not saying it's the one way or another, but we need to look into it and we need to analyze it. When it comes to universal services, what we're saying is that first of all, we need to evaluate this. Broadband access is a necessity, we believe, and some services today included in the universal service is outdated or will be outdated very soon. We think that it could be wise to look into some sort of broadband minimum quality. In Sweden today we have 1 megabit as the minimum quality of broadband, and this is supposed to give an acceptable access to the internet. But what that is, what an acceptable access is, it very much depends on how you use internet. What this is going to be in the future, I don't know. The only thing we can say for certain is that it's probably going to be more than what we have today. I don't know, one guess could be perhaps that in 2020 it could be 30 megabits, since that's what the European Union is working towards. And if it is so, then yes, we have a challenge in reaching there, but we need challenges because that's what makes us go ahead. We also believe that the level of harmonization should be starting from a minimum level of harmonization, but it should also allow certain member states or some member states to introduce higher requirements. And this is because we recognize the need of harmonization within the European market, but in the same time we think that harmonization itself should not be slowing down any individual market. So, and even though we're trying to create a common market and a single market in the European Union, we cannot disregard the fact that the situation in many countries are very different. So we don't think that we should make the level of harmonization in a way that the countries who are dragging a bit behind face impossible challenges, but we should also allow the countries that are in the front to continue to develop. Consumer protection framework is also very important. The current status is that we have fragmented rules and we have very low consumer trust. There is this one survey that shows that in Sweden the trust of a telecom operator is just a little bit below the trust of a used car dealer, and that is usually not a very good sign. So to be optimistic, you can say that there's a lot of room for improvement there. But we think that we need to start with consistent consumer protection rules, and we also need to see if not the general consumer protection legislation can be applied, and it should be to as large extent as possible. We should try to avoid, if possible, sector-specific rules, because it's more difficult to uphold. It's easier for everybody if everybody, regardless of the sector, apply to the same rules. And this, I think, is also important since, and we have also seen that here today, that the boundaries, what is one sector, what is another sector, these things are changing. And when you set up the rules and the framework for the future, you need to keep this open also for change, so that every time you get a new innovation, you don't have to change the entire system of the rules, because then you will eventually get left behind in one way or another. So the conclusions in our paper are that connectivity and high-capacity networks is a key sector-specific competition regulation. We see the future there for access regulation, and we need to reform and look into the SMP concept. We should analyze the caps and the whole service market, and of course the aim should be to reduce the regulatory burden and to see if we can rely more on competition legislation. In terms of universal services, we need to evaluate, update, and look also into different special needs, of course. And consumer protection, need to be in focus also, so we can strengthen the role of the consumer. So that is very briefly the Nordic paper, and I hope I kept it to 5 minutes. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. KALLSTRAND. I have one more question for you. You plead for a regulation of fixed access network that need to continue. But, on the other hand, you show a preference towards symmetric regulation of access to high-capacity fixed networks. So, how does the symmetric regulation you propose interact with the incentive to expand network coverage?
It has to do with the growth and the increasing demand. If we look into Sweden, we're not doing it now, but we're analyzing it, and next time around we will analyze it probably even more, and perhaps go into a state where we don't regulate copper anymore, but only fiber, because these two is today one market, but in the future it will probably not be. When we look at consumer demand, copper network is simply too slow, so it's not going to be the same. You can't compare a copper access to a fiber access. In Sweden, we reached about 1 year ago the level where we actually have more fiber connections than copper connections to the network. The most common speed that people have is 100 megabit, and the fastest growing is 1 gigabit, even though that's growing from a very low level, of course. Still, the fact that we're actually measuring it indicates something, because that is what we are.
Well, the demand for 1 gigabit is
there is actual demand.
Yes,
and people use it, and I think it's because of many different things. Netflix, of course, and then we have other brands as well. We have HBO, and we have some local Swedish companies, but the demand on that is enormous, and as a family household you need to be able to simultaneously watch cartoons on one big screen on Netflix, and then perhaps Game of Thrones on another one for the parents, whereas at the same time you're twittering or being on Facebook, and you use it for Wi-Fi also to connect other things in your home. So we need speed.
I think we should all brace for 4K content, video content, and streaming all over the Europe and the world, because that's not the future, is the coming present, I would say.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your input to our conference.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.